To go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Good morning, you're watching and listening to GB News. Coming up on The Political Correction, we're talking about Boris Johnson surviving his no-confidence vote, the Grenfell Tower fire 5-year anniversary, and the High Court's ruling to go ahead with sending asylum seekers to Rwanda. That plus plenty more after your latest news with Tatiana.
Good morning, it's 10 o'clock. I'm Tatiana Sanchez in the GB newsroom. Unions have hit out against a potential government plan to allow agency workers to fill in for striking staff. It's believed the Transport Secretary hasn't ruled out the option, with travellers facing widespread industrial action later on this month. The RMT says Grant Shapps needs to stop smearing the union and unshackle companies so they can negotiate a settlement. Train drivers overwhelmingly voted to take action over a pay dispute. The Northern Ireland Protocol Bill is due to be published tomorrow. Northern Ireland Secretary Brandon Lewis says new powers to scrap elements of the protocol won't breach international law, and the legislation will protect and respect the Good Friday Agreement.
Fundamentally, what is stopping the Northern Ireland Assembly and the Executive getting back up and running. And at the moment, the way the protocol is working, the way the EU want to see it implemented, is fundamentally undermining the Belfast Good Friday Agreement that has given us now 24 years of peace and growing prosperity in Northern Ireland. We've got to fix that. It's damaging for businesses and for people in Northern Ireland, and we've got to fix it. So we will be laying out tomorrow, as we said we would do, we're going to lay out some legislation tomorrow that will resolve those issues with the Northern Ireland Protocol in a way that protects and respects the Belfast Good Friday Agreement.
President Volodymyr Zelensky says Ukraine has recaptured villages and towns in the southeastern regions of Kherson and Zaporizhzhia. He also says fierce street fights are continuing in the eastern city of Severodonetsk. It's after he met with the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen to discuss Ukraine's request to join the EU. He says he's hopeful and described the meeting as very fruitful. Hundreds of people have been marching across the US cities as part of anti-gun violence protests. Teachers and students, among others, called on Congress to pass legislation aimed at curbing gun violence. Well, late last month, the gunman in Uvalde, Texas, killed 19 children and 2 teachers, just days after another gunman killed 10 people in Buffalo, New York grocery store. President Joe Biden backed the protests.
Yes, keep marching. It's important. Look, this has to become an election issue. The way people listen, senators, congressmen, is when people say, this is going to affect my vote. Too many people are dying needlessly. And what's even being proposed in the House and Senate is marginal. I mean, it's important, but it's not all that needs to be done.
And the Queen has become the world's second longest reigning modern monarch. The 96-year-old overtakes Thailand's king, who reigned for 70 years and 126 days. The longest reigning monarch is Louis XIV of France, with a 72-year and 110-day reign. This is GB News. We'll bring you more news as it happens. Now it's back to the political correction.
Good morning, you're watching and listening to GB News, and this is The Political Correction. I'm Jenna Davison, and today I'm joined in the studio by Paul Embry. We are here for the next 2 hours to correct politics and put you, the people, back in charge. This is not about journalists talking to journalists, it's about you telling us what you think. Coming up this hour, we're talking about what's been a turbulent week for Boris Johnson, which started with him surviving the vote of no confidence. We're also discussing the High Court's ruling to send asylum seekers to Rwanda after a legal challenge this week. And Tuesday marks 5 years since the tragic Grenfell Tower fire. We're joined by a barrister and former firefighter to talk about the events of that fateful day and where we are 5 years down the line. And as ever, if you want to get involved in the conversation today, then please email us at gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at gbnews. This is The Political Correction. Now, it's been a turbulent week for the Prime Minister, which started with him surviving a vote of no confidence. In his first Commons appearance since surviving the vote, Boris Johnson said he was determined to get on with his job, despite 4 in 10 Tory MPs declaring a lack of confidence in his premiership. In the wake of the vote, the PM announced plans to extend the Right to Buy scheme, which helped millions of people purchase their council properties at a huge discount back in the 1980s and 1990s. So, Paul, what's been your read of what's been going on in Parliament this week?
Well, when it comes to the Tories, Deanna, I mean, I never like to intrude on private grief. But
you'll make an exception this week.
I'll make an exception this week. I mean, the truth is, it's very kind of unseemly. You know, there's been blood on the carpet in the Tory party, and they love a bit of regicide. You know that as much as I do. The Tories.
You don't have to go far back through our history to see that, do you?
Well,
really?
Exactly. They go in for regicide far more than the Labour Party do, which I think is sometimes not always a good thing with the Labour Party, to be honest. But look, I think in truth, Boris Johnson is probably a dead man walking. Actually, I don't see how any Prime Minister can lose the support so graphically, so openly of 41% of his MPs and not be seriously hobbled. I mean, I think the chances of his fighting the next election as leader of the Tory party are almost non-existent. And I suspect really it's just a matter of time. I think the problem is for Boris Johnson, I think I believe that he's got this sense of entitlement which, you know, leads him to believe he's got some kind of God-given right to rule, and would probably be dragged kicking and screaming out of Downing Street, to be honest. So I suspect that he has got a bit of a bunker mentality. You know, I'm not going anywhere. I've won the vote, and therefore that should be the end of it. But the truth is, it's not going to be the end of it. When you've got a sizable minority of your MPs against you, I suspect it's just a matter of time.
And I think there's been talk supposedly in the newspapers amongst some rebels about sort of vote strikes, which for the Tory party to be considering strikes is always an interesting one. I mean, personally, I think
you might find me supportive.
I know, for a change.
You're going to go in for strike action.
I think it's a bonkers idea because as MPs we're there to vote on legislation as it's put in front of us. So personally, it's not something that I'd ever support anyway. But I just thought that was an interesting one for you, Paul.
What I'm interested in is your statement during the week. Obviously, you released a statement saying that you didn't vote for the Prime Minister in the Commons. What were your reasons for that? Similar reasons to others who did the same?
Well, it was a big decision, as anyone should have treated it like a big decision. It's a big question we're being asked, and the country's in very difficult circumstances. For me, I think there's been this kind of perception that some of the Tories who voted against him have done it purely on the sort of Partygate thing, that we're being sucked into some kind of Remainer, mainstream media kind of trap, which I don't think is the case at all. I mean, for me, hearing reflections of my constituents and what they went through during the COVID pandemic and how disappointed they are with kind of what was going on in Number 10, that's one factor. But for me, it's the fact that, you know, we have this 80-seat majority. We have an incredible opportunity to really try and shape the country. Obviously, the country's in very difficult circumstances at the moment, and I feel we should be doing more. We should be being more conservative. We should be cutting taxes, really giving businesses the opportunities to thrive. And so, for me, that was kind of more of my reasoning for deciding to vote the way that I did. Now, a lot of people didn't share how they voted. It was a secret ballot, and I fully kind of respect their right to keep it a secret. But for me, you know, I had so many of my constituents asking me which way I was going to vote. It felt right to put that across, to be really transparent and open about it. And I think the thing that I found the most interesting, and I'm going to talk kind of directly to our audience here, has been some of the kickback I've got from some of our own viewers. I hope some of you are watching this morning saying that you won't be watching me on GB News anymore because you disagree with the decision that I made. But for me, that is exactly what GB News is all about. We are here because we believe that differing views should be represented. We believe that we should have open and honest debates. And we are not the channel that cancels people because they have views that we disagree with. So I sincerely hope, and this is my plea to you, stick with us. Stick with us, because we are going to continue to have these debates. I'm going to continue to argue with Paul about all things to do with trade unions. Nothing there has changed, but we do want to hear from you. We want to hear your views. So do send us your thoughts on what happened this week. Are you still backing the Prime Minister? Do you think he should go? Let us know. Send us your views on gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at gbnews.
What are the... I mean, in terms of the rebel group in the Parliamentary Tory party, obviously you will know these people very, very well. What kind of proportion of them are likely to accept that the vote has been done. He's won it, albeit not particularly decisively. But, you know, let's take our foot off the pedal now and get behind him. What proportion do you think are likely to say, look, this vote was just a stepping stone? He clearly has got a significant number against him. We've now got to you know, redouble our efforts to shift him.
It's really hard to say, because I think there's talk as though it's this kind of one homogenous group that are kind of plotting and planning all together, and certainly from my experience, that's absolutely not the case. I didn't really discuss my vote with any colleagues before I went and made it. I did it based off kind of my own conscience, my own constituents, and that. Certainly not involved in a pork pie plot coup, as I was accused of earlier in the year. And there are so many kind of different kind of factions who seem to be involved. I think someone worked out pretty much every Conservative intake since, I think, 83 has been represented, with people, you know, sort of saying they're not supporting the Prime Minister. There's people on the right of the party, on the left of the party. So it's kind of hard to kind of make a judgment in that regard. But I think, frankly, the majority of people in the party believe in democracy. Ultimately, that's why we stand for election, because we believe in the power of democracy. The vote has happened, the Prime Minister has won, and frankly, we just need to crack on. We need to crack on, making sure that we're dealing with the cost of living crisis, making sure that we're continuing to offer the support that we need to Ukraine. And some people may be disappointed in the result. They may have wished it had gone another way. But ultimately, as Conservatives, we come together and do what's best for the country, what's best for our constituencies. And so I guess this is a plea to the colleagues who perhaps might want to take some more action to try and unseat the Prime Minister. You know, let's just come together and do what we can to make this country the absolute best place it can be.
And is one of the problems for the Rebels the fact that there doesn't seem to be a standout candidate who people are uniting around? I mean, for example, when Thatcher was challenged, obviously Heseltine, who was a big heavyweight figure himself, put up the challenge. When John Major resigned as leader of the Conservative Party and invited people to challenge him in 95, John Redwood was obviously the candidate. Again, another big hitter. It seems to me that on this occasion, there doesn't seem to be an obvious candidate. I mean, people have mentioned Jeremy Hunt. I have to say, I don't find him in any way, I would say this anyway, of course, but even if I were a Tory voter, I wouldn't particularly find him in any way inspiring. Rishi Sunak's star is clearly in the descendancy at the moment rather than in the ascendancy. Liz Truss seems to be a Lib Dem who's managed to find her way into the Tory party. I mean, are the Rebels kind of split on who should be the next leader and whether they're able to unite behind a single candidate? There's a teasing question.
I guess it comes back to the answer I gave you a minute ago, which is, you know, the Rebels are not one homogenous group. The people who, you know, voted the way that they did on Monday and voted not to back the Prime Minister are from such an array kind of across the party of ideologies and intakes and whatnot. So I do think there is a point there that there isn't kind of one standout natural successor at the moment. But that's not actually that unusual. I mean, you go back to the leadership contest where David Cameron won, and if someone had said sort of 6 months before that he would have been the next leader of the party, I think people would have kind of shaken their heads and sort of said, absolutely not. You know, he's not a standout. I think what leadership contests often do is they bring people to the table who perhaps hadn't quite been considered, hadn't quite been tested, sort of over in the party membership, in the national media so much. And really, you know, let's just see what they're made of and whether they're up to the task. So, you know, if we do get to a point where there's a leadership contest, and of course there isn't a leadership contest at the moment, you know, the Prime Minister is still the Prime Minister, and, you know, I think it will be an opportunity for people to put themselves forward, to be really tested out, and for the Conservative Party to find the absolute best person.
There's another option, of course, general election.
There is an option for general election, which is being discussed at the moment. There was some speculation it was being used as a bit of a threat, with the Prime Minister saying, well, if I lose, then there'll be an election immediately.
There's also those sorts of tactics with it, I
have no idea, but I mean, you know, frankly, if we talk about, if we go to the principle that there is so much going on in the country at the moment, it was the wrong time for a leadership contest, which is a line that was being used by a lot of people, then absolutely. Doesn't that also mean it's exactly the wrong time for a general election to throw our political system completely into upheaval?
I mean, from a general election point of view, I mean, you know, playing devil's advocate slightly, I'm not sure it would be. I think when you're in opposition, you can never be seen to shy away from calling for a general election, of course, because people will look at that and say, oh, you're running scared because you know that you're not likely to win. So oppositions will always call for general elections. I mean, as somebody in the Labour movement, I am far from convinced at the moment that whatever the polls are saying, that the Labour Party is in any place at the moment to win a general election and to form a next government. I mean, I know people are arguing, well, some of the polls are showing Labour 20 points in front. Well, actually, you know, if you go back to the days of Michael Foot, he was 20 points in front during the early 80s when Thatcher was in charge. And Kinnock, between 87 and 92, often polled, you know, 20% in front of Thatcher at first, and then Major a bit more later. And obviously Labour lost that election. So I guess my advice to the Labour Party is be careful what you wish for. I mean, I wouldn't expect a general election at the moment, but I don't particularly think it's in either party's interest.
And obviously Labour still have the Scotland problem.
Labour still have a Scotland problem, and it's very difficult to see Labour forming a UK government without resolving that Scotland problem, or at least making some sort of inroads into Scotland. I think Labour has still got a red wall problem. I think the local elections recently showed that there is still that Brexit legacy in some of those red wall seats. I suspect, Deanna, that the problem for the Conservative, I'd be interested in your take on this, the problem for the Conservative Party at the moment is I think they're trying to play to two audiences. So they've got, if you like, the traditional Conservative voters in the shires, in the South East, and there's a danger there that because they're not acting, you know, traditionally Conservative in a fiscal sense, that the Lib Dems are going to steal a lot of their votes away there. But the danger is, if they do revert to, if you like, the old Conservative Party before they made their pitch to the red wall and talked about levelling up and investment, regeneration and all the rest of it, getting Brexit done, then they'll lose a lot of those red wall seats, I suspect. So that's the balance. And I would think as a red waller, you'd call it a blue wall, obviously,
Absolutely.
but I think as a red waller, you would be in favour of the second strategy, wouldn't you? Keep making the pitch to the red wall seats, because
the thing is, I don't think that the two are mutually exclusive. You know, you talk about sort of traditional conservatism, tax cutting. That is something that benefits everyone. I mean, being fiscally conservative is a good thing for the red wall too. So I don't think there's a need necessarily to try and play to two audiences, when as long as we get our narrative right, the stuff that we should be doing, can be doing, are doing to an extent appeal to both. But I think Labour's in exactly the same position, though, trying to win back its old kind of traditional heartlands while still appealing to the sort of more metropolitan areas. So
yeah, I mean, the Labour Party has always been that electoral coalition of what I call Hampstead and Hartlepool, where, you know, it can't just win with blue-collar Britain. It can't just win with working-class votes. It needs to build out to a layer of more metropolitan kind of liberal middle-class voters in order to win enough votes to win a general election. I think, and I've argued many times on this programme, Labour's big problem over recent years has been the fact that it has tried to appeal too much to that second group of people, and in doing so has alienated so much the first group of people. And I think, you know, Brexit was an example of that, where Labour was overwhelmingly pro-Remain in a way that actually contradicted its history when there was, you know, a strong anti-EU feeling in the Labour Party traditionally once upon a time. And by also becoming, as a party itself, you know, much more graduate, middle-class, liberal, based in the cities, very London-centric, it alienated many of those red wallers, and because of that, the coalition fell apart effectively. And I think if you're the Labour Party, you've got to start with your base and build out. I think what the Labour Party has done over recent years is tried to pitch to that Hampstead element of the coalition, and in doing so has just completely lost its base, and is a long way from winning that base back still.
Well, everything is certainly topsy-turvy in politics, but send us your thoughts as ever, gbviews@gbnews.uk. Now, a report by Ofgem has found that power firms must improve their storm response after Storm Arwen left more than 1 million UK homes without power last year. The energy regulator said that emergency plans initiated before the storm were not adequate, and they recommended that firms should develop more robust mechanisms to ensure compensation payments are delivered swiftly and accurately. Well, joining us now to discuss the report is the Minister of State for Business, Energy and Clean Growth, Greg Hands. Greg, thank you for joining us this morning. I guess first question is kind of, what is government's response to the Ofgem reports?
Well, there's actually two reports, Deanna. There's one from government and one from Ofgem in tandem, released last week. It's a comprehensive review of the lessons from Storm Arwen. As you rightly pointed out, more than 1 million people were without power. 75,000 no power for 48 hours, as many as about 4,000, including some of your constituents, for a week or more. So it's a really serious disruption. I would say there's three broad areas to learn from. First is on network resilience. How do you make your electricity network more resilient and more storm resistant? Secondly, how do you deal better with customers in such a sort of a widespread power outage situation? Certainly in your area, Northern Power Grid, it's quite clear from the report, didn't do a good enough job on servicing customers in the immediate aftermath. And the third area is on compensation, making sure that people get good compensation paid as promptly as possible. Ofgem have added an extra 10 million in redress payments on top of the 34 million already paid in compensation. Some of the companies, the distribution network operators, are quite profitable. Northern Power Grid has announced pretty strong results recently. There's definitely the ability there to provide compensation for those customers, without power for more than a week. As you know, I was up your way, actually Rich Holden's constituency next door, and met with people who are really, understandably, really angry about being without power, with nobody really giving them a straight answer, for many days on end. So I think I would say broadly those areas: the network, compensation, and communications, Deanna.
On the compensation front, there's also a call, isn't there, for the power companies to voluntarily lift the cap if power outages go on for more than a certain length of time. Is that something that government could potentially look at making compulsory rather than voluntary?
Well, I think we've got a series of actions in our report, and we'll be making sure that all of these actions get delivered on. In terms of making sure that compensation happens, that is something which is a top priority for us. There are actions in our report and in Ofgem's report. We'll be checking really carefully to make sure that those actions are taken. At the moment, Northern Power Grid, for example, I think about 90% got their compensation within 2 months, but 2 months is in itself too slow. The storm, as you'll remember, right at the end of November, that basically meant that they didn't get. I remember you asked me in the House of Commons, I think it was your question, when are people going to get paid? Are they going to get it for Christmas? And we weren't able to say that people were going to get their compensation payment in time for Christmas, and that turned out to be the case. 90% got it by the end of January, but that still isn't good enough.
Completely agreed. And there's one area that I've had a few constituents, and certainly I've seen a few comments in media, that the Ofgem report in particular doesn't necessarily seem to address, and that's around maintenance issues and the kind of ongoing resilience of the network. So how is government going to step in there to make sure that we are as protected as possible from any future storms?
Well, I think what we're looking at, the direction we're going in here is instead of saying to transmission network, so the transmission, if you like, is the main kind of the motorways of electricity, and the distribution network, which, if you like, are the sort of side streets. How do you then distribute that power to individual homes, to communities, and so on? Before, the way it's been approached has been different things that need to be implemented. We've put different requirements on electricity network companies to approach things in particular ways. I think the way we're now going to move towards is looking at outcomes rather than taking measures and saying, sort of like almost like a box filling exercise. We're going to ask them to make sure that their network is resilient. One of the things about Storm Arwen was it was an unusual storm, the first of its kind in more than 40 years. A particular strength, duration of the wind, the particular temperature was quite important, and the fact that it was a northerly direction. So it came from an unusual direction. So all of those things combined knocked over a lot of trees. And the particular issue in northeast England in particular was a number of trees being knocked down onto power lines. So we want to make sure that the networks, instead of just, if you like, making some implementing some measures, they actually test, what is the resilience of their network in different scenarios. I think that is the better way to go to make sure that these rare events are not as impactful as Arwen was.
Brilliant. Well, Greg, thank you for joining us this morning. Greg Hands, Minister of State for Business, Energy and Clean Growth, talking about the aftermath of Storm Arwen. Now, Boris Johnson described planned strikes by the RMT as reckless and wanton during Prime Minister's questions this week. It was after the union announced 3 days of national strike action, with over 40,000 workers expected to stage a walkout over job cuts and pay freezes. Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer has said he believes the strike should not go ahead, but his party have been accused of being conflicted on the issue, with Shadow Levelling Up Secretary Lisa Nandy saying Labour are on the public side as well as on the rail workers' side. Well, we're joined now by RMT General Secretary Mick Lynch. Mick, thank you for joining us this morning. Now, there's been a lot of kickback, hasn't there, about your proposed strike action, saying it's going to completely shut down the country and put undue pressure on workers who are already facing a real difficult time because of the cost of living crisis. How do you respond to that?
Well, workers are facing undue pressure because their companies, including the railway, are not giving them a pay rise. The vast majority of people in this country, particularly public sector workers, have had wage austerity brought in by the Tory government, even since Osborne and the Osborne and Cameron duo, and people are suffering. They haven't got enough money. They can't afford to heat their homes. They can't afford to eat in some cases, and maybe they can't afford to clothe their children. So what's happening is that the business class in this country is putting people into impoverishment. We've also got the reward that while our members were working and Tory party leaders were partying, they've now been faced with massive job cuts. Thousands of jobs are being stripped. And in order to do that, they're going to cut back on safety standards. And we're also faced with what is essentially an internal fire and rehire, where all our conditions will be ripped up. So our members are angry, as are many other British workers, and they need a response to that. We need a pay rise, we need job security, and we need decent working conditions from companies.
A lot of the rhetoric, as you will know, around this dispute has been, especially from the RMT's critics, has been, well-paid train drivers simply out to feather their own nests even more. This is what this is about. I mean, that's a bit of a lie, isn't it? I mean, this dispute is encompassing a whole range of workers, many of whom are nothing like train drivers. That's my understanding. Am I right on that?
You're correct. I mean, this myth of the high-paid train driver and that every rail worker is in that position is a Daily Mail and Tory graft fantasy, and GB News has no trouble putting out that myth as well. The vast majority of people in this dispute are on very modest salaries. The median wage of a railway worker that we cover is £31,000 a year. So they need a pay rise. That is not that is below the national average, as I understand it. It's below the mythical nurse that everyone points to. They're on an average of 33,000, I understand. And there's also this myth put about that somehow if a rail worker does not get a pay rise, that the bosses in this country are going to transfer that somehow to bin men and care workers and nurses and other people who are underpaid and are being exploited. The fact is, if we don't get a pay rise, the rail companies who made £500 million in profit last year, on the poorest year for the railway in history, will make even more profit going forward. And the railways will recover, and we need them to recover because they're an essential part of our transport future, both in terms of carbon emissions and getting rid of congestion and moving goods and people efficiently and cleanly around the country. So Grant Shapps needs to stop threatening people, keep changing the rules halfway through the game. We've complied with the anti-trade union laws, and we'll get on with our dispute if there's not a settlement. We're in constant discussions with the companies, and will be this week. We were last week, and we will look for a settlement that our members can live with. But at the moment, we've had no offers, and our members, many of them have suffered a pay freeze for 2 and 3 years, and that's not acceptable.
So, Mick, you talk about kind of being on the side of workers, and clearly you're there to represent kind of RMT union members. But what about workers in other fields who are going to struggle, if not find it impossible to get to work, may completely lose their wage packet? Like, how on earth do you justify this to them?
Well, our members will lose their wage packets. I mean, our members are going to lose 3 days' pay that week.
Yeah, but that's a choice to take part in the strike, though, whereas others are being affected without that choice.
I'll finish it if you like. You want me to finish or not?
You can be combative, Mick, but, I think it was a reasonable comeback.
Would you like me to finish the question before you ask your next one? OK, so all workers in this country need a pay rise. It's your government, I think you're an MP, who's driven down wages in collaboration with the employers. They have deliberately suppressed public sector pay. And if they hadn't done that for a continuous period, we wouldn't have people who are so poor they have to make a choice between heating and eating. We've now got a country where the average life expectancy is falling. That's the job of the Tory government that's brought that in. We cannot be blamed for other workers being exploited by bosses in this country while there are more billionaires than we've ever had, and the rich have never been richer. Dividends are being paid out, profits are being recorded at record levels, and what business needs to do, the business community, is think about the exploitation they're imposing on people and give them a decent wage. Now, we're part of that, and I hope the Labour movement can recover its founding principles that all workers united together deserve a square deal of corporate Britain. And I hope that other unions can rally around what the RMT is doing and stand up for the ordinary worker in this country and get them a deal.
But with respect, you didn't actually answer my question there, which is how do you justify taking away potentially other people's earning capacity here by stopping them from actually getting to work and accessing those opportunities? Because your workers have made a choice to join the strike, but others haven't.
Their employers could choose to pay them if they wished. That's the choice that the companies would make to deduct their pay, isn't it?
I know, but you're taking away their ability to actually access their workplace.
Well, are you saying that the company should deduct their pay if they can't get to work? Is that what you're
Sometimes it happens. Sometimes people are on those sort of contracts where they only get paid for the hours that they turn up and do. It's a business's choice. It's an employee's choice to take a part in one of those contracts. But you are stopping them from getting to work.
It's not a choice. They're the only contracts that are made available, and the Tory government has made those very readily accessible to companies all over the country. So the gig economy, casual work, vulnerable work, precarious work, is all a part of the lack of legislation that continuous governments have failed to bring in to protect workers in this country. Companies don't need to deduct wages. They can give them alternate methods. They can give them lieu days. They can do all sorts of things. So they don't need to lose pay because of the RMT strike. It's up to the companies to make that decision. And it seems to me that the rhetoric that yourself and others are putting up is whipping up a storm against a legitimate, lawful industrial dispute that's very simple. If we get a deal on pay, if we get a deal on job security, and we maintain our conditions through negotiation, we won't have to have an industrial dispute.
So, Mick, there's this new potential plan now from Grant Shapps and the government to actually get agency workers on board to maintain some real minimal level of service. What's your response to that?
Well, it's illegal at the minute, isn't it? And Grant Shapps should defend the rule of law, but now he's threatening to change the law in order to break an industrial dispute. I don't think it'll have any particular effect. These regulations have been in place for a fairly long time. I think they were brought in by the Blair government, and they've been completely ineffective. People are using these in disputes already, which is against the law. So rather than saying that he's going to change the law every time he's at a disadvantage, what he should do is unshackle the companies and fund the railways correctly so that we can have a settlement to this dispute. And then he wouldn't have to keep running back to his backbenchers who are foaming at the mouth, virtually asking for effective industrial action to be banned in this country and emasculate workers all over so that they can open the way for more exploitation. And it's the same with everything. If they can't make enough money or the money they like out of the current legal setup, they'll change the legal setup so it can exploit people even more. So he ought to concentrate on something else rather than changing the law every other week.
Well, Mick Lynch there, the General Secretary of the RMT, joining us to talk about the proposed rail strikes. Now, coming up on the political correction, we are joined by Kelvin MacKenzie to talk more about RMT strike action, so don't go anywhere.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV,
on radio, on digital.
Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices.
With honest and civilised conversation.
We're not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
The national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
Join us for Ministry of Offence, the comedy panel show that's just like the news, in that the left fights the right and it doesn't really seem to matter who wins. We cover the big stories. It was in fact a troop of baboons and not angry vegans.
I like that.
And the really important stories.
Fat naked cow gets stuck in swimming pool.
It's a headline in a lot of local newspapers. Yeah.
We're on the same team, Nick. Yeah, but I'm just helping you.
Join us for Ministry of Offence, Saturday nights, 8 o'clock on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back to The Political Correction. Before the break, we were joined by Mick Lynch, the General Secretary of the RMT Union. And I'm delighted to say now we're joined by former editor of The Sun, Kelvin Mackenzie. Kelvin, thank you for joining us this morning. What do you make of this proposed industrial action by the RMT?
By the way, I thought that was an absolutely shocking piece of PR on behalf of the RMT by the General Secretary there. His dissembling on most of these important issues was simply disgraceful. So let's just deal with what the country has done for the RMT and its 40,000 employees, 20,000 of whom have had pay rises over the last couple of years. And the fact that the train system even functions today is entirely due to the fact that the government has nationalised everything. And were it not for being nationalised, the train system wouldn't be there at all. So we're all paying to keep these 40,000 Herberts in a job. The bottom line on this is this. There is a pay rise to be had and a deal to be had. Everybody accepts that. These are difficult times. Everybody accepts that. And were the government to signal to the RMT, who are getting their pay rise, as you alluded to in your question, on the back of ordinary workers being used as the battering ram because our working life is so intrinsically linked with transport that if there is no transport, there's a very good job that our economy goes backwards and people lose their jobs. They are using ordinary people as a battering ram for this. Let's face what they face, right? First of all, there's no chance. They're asking for an 11% pay rise or something absolutely absurd, right? Secondly, 2,500 of the RMT workers are going to be laid off because their jobs are no longer required. Why are they no longer required? Because 25% of the passenger traffic is no longer going to the station anymore. Why? There's two reasons for this. The main one being, that some people with COVID don't want to do it, so that's a small one. But the other one is that people are now working in different ways. COVID has brought in an industrial revolution into our country. People are working 3 days a week rather than 5 days a week going to their office. They're going 3 days to the office, 2 at home, right? Now, this particularly affects London and the southeast because we uniquely across Europe have a commuter system where people travel huge amounts of distance in order to get to their place of work. That world has gone in the same way as I don't have to come to the GB studio in Paddington to give my rather centre-right views, shall we say. I can do this from my rather nice area of the country. So there is one other issue. The government cannot and must not pay this blackmail, because if they do, the queue of other state workers will be literally 10 times round the block. So they can't pay it. So a strike is going to take place. And as with the miners and as with Wapping, the government must stay strong, or the employers must stay strong, and they must win this battle. It is a painful battle. I feel sorry for the rail workers being involved in this. But as you listen to Mr. Lynch, you know where he comes from. He comes from the far left. And in fact, the president of the RMT is a long-time communist who sits on the this is the guy who wants to destroy our country, let alone destroy the railways.
Mr. McKenzie, if I can just intervene there. I mean, I'm interested that you describe an 11% pay claim, which I'm quite sure the RMT would be prepared to negotiate on, by the way, an 11% pay claim as absurd. This is the politics of envy, isn't it? And I'm quite surprised to hear that kind of line from you, because I understood that you were very much a free marketeer. I thought you were a Thatcherite. I thought you were in favour of people using whatever abilities they had in the marketplace to be able to negotiate what they're worth. So my question to you is, why is it acceptable for rich people, if you let me finish the question, why is it acceptable for rich people and people at the top to be able to negotiate their worth? And you say, that's fine, crack on, that's what you're entitled to, that's what you deserve. But when it comes to ordinary working class people and trade unions, you say, don't give in. Let's take an authoritarian view and say, no, we're not going to allow you even to take strike action, which seems to be almost the line that you're taking.
Kelvin?
No, I'm saying take strike action and let them get defeated. Right? I wasn't against, I was hostile to the miners doing what they were doing, trying to turn the lights out, but in the end they were defeated. And I think this is a matter.
And look at the price that was paid for that. Look at the price that was paid for that in terms of the decay that set in working class communities that relied on the pit village. Don't you look at things like the miners' strike and think to yourself, actually, we shouldn't really try that again?
No, that's rubbish. There were communities that were left to rot. I do accept that, and that was a mistake. But it wasn't a mistake. The miners wanted to kill us and wanted to turn our lights off and wanted to turn the country into some rather bizarre kind of East European regime. The miners,
Mr. McKenzie, the miners were fighting for their jobs and their livelihoods.
Right, one at a time, chaps. Kelvin.
As the miners were doing, and we must not allow it to happen. And were it to happen, and by the way, this idea that 11% you're talking about, old man, actually comes from the taxpayer, right? That's where the money is coming from. These are nationalised industries, as you well know. So I personally don't want to pay any more taxes to fund the RMT or its employees.
Well, I mean, I think it's obscene, frankly, that you can say miners were out to kill people when all they were trying to do is defend their industries and defend their jobs and their livelihoods. But let's go back to the RMT if we can. You can't, on the one hand, argue, as you seem to be doing, look, they shouldn't be going on strike because this is a vital service, this is an essential service, but at the same time say, yeah, well, it's an essential service, but we shouldn't pay them a decent pay increase. If it's a vital essential service and the work that they do is essential to the functioning of this country, then pay them properly. Why do you object to that?
No, I accept that totally. The transport system in all its forms, right, is the way that industry works. I'm not against them being paid. I have said, and they have said themselves, that they're not prepared to make any accommodation on terms and conditions in order for them to earn any money. So you have some ridiculous arcane ideas which the management of the rail companies are saying have to be changed in order for us to prosper in a circumstance where our revenues are only 75% of what they were 2 years ago.
So what would you
do? Let me ask you a question. What would you do if you were running a business that only had 3/4 of the revenues that it had 2 years ago? Wouldn't you look at making cost cuts, let alone giving pay rises?
Well, the RMT is perfectly entitled to set out its position and then get into a negotiation on that position, which they will do, and that always happens. What I'm interested
Do you think they will?
What I'm interested in is why you think it's okay.
They've called a strike for June 21, 23 and 24.
And there's a window, and this is how industrial relations work. I know a little bit about it. There's a window of opportunity between that strike, between now and that strike for those negotiations to take place. But what I'm interested is why you always seem to attack working class people, why it's always keeping working class people. Then what have you said about all of the people who have made a killing out of the pandemic, the people who made a killing around PPE and stuff like that? What have you said about the fact that city bonuses have risen six times faster than ordinary wages?
Some money.
Right, let's...
You know, what on earth has that got to do with it? It's a complete canard.
Because you never...
I don't know why you're bothering
with it.
Right,
chaps...
Because you never talk about it. You're not interested in the fact that city bonuses at the moment are rising 6 times faster than ordinary wages. You're not interested in those sorts of injustices. You just want to attack ordinary workers defending their pay and conditions. It's what you did when you were at The Sun, and you're still doing it.
Paul, let's give Mr Mackenzie right of reply, then we're going to have to wrap up. Kelvin?
Sorry, what was that?
Just said right of reply to what Paul's just been saying.
No, I'm not getting involved in the debate about... I am here to talk about the RMT, and it's as simple as that. I'll talk about other issues on other occasions, but the RMT is my sole focus here today.
Well, we know that.
Well, this has been a fiery one. Kelvin, thank you for joining us, and Paul, thank you for your feedback there as well. But we want to hear from you. What did you make of Mick Lynch, Kelvin Mackenzie, Paul Embry's contributions to this discussion, and what do you think about the proposed train strikes? Do you support the RMT? Do you think that the train strike shouldn't go ahead? Let us know. gbviews@gbnews.uk. Now, Tuesday the 14th of June marks 5 years since the tragic Grenfell Tower fire, which saw 72 people lose their lives. The fire was started by a malfunctioning fridge freezer and spread rapidly due to the cladding and external insulation on the building. Joining us now to talk about the tragic events of June the 14th, 2017 and the upcoming 5-year anniversary is barrister and former firefighter Lucy Massoud. Lucy, thank you for your time this morning. I guess, firstly, what are your kind of reflections on the day itself? Were you actually involved in the incident?
I didn't attend on the day itself. That was the Red Watch. I was based at Chelsea White Watch at the time. But I remember waking up the next day to about 100 plus phone calls from friends, family, various colleagues, various trade union officials, etc. So I just remember getting down to the site straight away and just, it was just breathtaking. At the time, the building was still essentially on fire by the time I got there. And it was just really trying to speak with the firefighters. I spoke with many of them the day after, and just seeing the utter sort of despair on their faces of what they'd seen on the night that fire took place. And as much as they did try and help, and as much as they did save many, many people, they were very aware that a lot of people had perished on that day. And of course, that's something that will stay with them for the rest of their lives. And then, of course, the following days, it was just a sense of shock, shock within the community, shock within the fire brigade, just not knowing how something so horrific could happen in this country. Kensington is the richest borough in Europe. So for a building with that many people in, situated where it was, to be covered in illegal flammable cladding, and for 72 people to burn to death in their beds is just unthinkable. That's something that you might think would happen in a third world country, certainly not this country. And it's just staggering to think 5 years on and we are still without answers. Those bereaved family members, those victims are still without answers to their questions. And this inquiry, this public inquiry that has been ongoing now for some years, whether it will deliver the bereaved families what they want, I don't know. I don't hold much hope. But yeah, this anniversary on Tuesday, as it is every year, is going to be a tough one. I remember a year on, I was actually at the 1 year anniversary with Paul Embry, who you're sitting next to. And we attended a church service, and then we did the silent walk. And again, we're just dealing with a community that was utterly still in shock a year on, and they're still in shock now, 5 years on. But they're starting to get angry now, understandably so. Every month on the 14th, there's a silent walk. I suspect that when the inquiry does conclude, if this community doesn't get the answers it wants, that silent walk isn't going to be silent for much longer. I think the community are going to start really raising their voices, and absolutely rightly so.
Well, Lucy, of course, the inquiry split into two elements. The first phase concluded back in October 2019, and some of those recommendations have been implemented by the London Fire Brigade and some by the Home Office. But you're part of the Justice for Grenfell campaign. What has your response been to kind of government action so far?
I wouldn't say I'm part of the campaign itself. I'm wearing an FBU Justice for Grenfell T-shirt. I'm still closely involved within the community, and of course, I always offer them my full solidarity. I mean, I would say 5 years on from Grenfell, and we know that at least 58 buildings in this country are still covered in the same type of illegal flammable cladding that Grenfell Tower was. Now, despite the law changing and requiring property developers to remove that cladding from those buildings, property developers have refused to act, or some property developers have refused to act, and there's still buildings with that cladding on. So hundreds of residents throughout this country living in those buildings, living in those death traps, are understandably in fear of their lives. And so they should be. I absolutely would be if I was living in a building that had the same type of cladding that Grenfell had on it. So my question is to those property developers and to this government, what will it take for proper action to take place? Do we need another Grenfell tragedy? Despite it already being the biggest loss of life in post-war history, it's utterly disgusting that we still have 58 buildings in this country covered in the same type of illegal flammable cladding that was wrapped around Grenfell Tower and led to 72 men, women and children burning to death in their beds.
Paul?
Lucy, we obviously served in the fire service together before you embarked on your new career, and I know, as you mentioned, you were based at Chelsea Fire Station, which is quite close to Grenfell Tower, and many of your colleagues attended that incident. How are your colleagues? Because obviously what people don't recognise sometimes is that incidents like that, horrific as they are, can have a profound effect on the emergency services attending them. What's been the response of your colleagues, and how are they bearing up?
The discussions I had with them at the time, and of course I'm still close with quite a few of them. I pop into Chelsea Fire Station quite a lot just to say hello or to park my car, or if I'm just sort of having a mince up and down the King's Road, I still keep in close contact with them. But also I have friends who are based at both Kensington Fire Stations as well, so I speak to them. And it's just something that they will never get over. They are haunted by it. But of course, and you'll know this, Paul, it's not just the firefighters, it's the control workers as well. It's the control workers who are on the end of the phone advising those residents in Grenfell Tower who were literally listening to people die on the other end of their phone. We know since Grenfell, many firefighters and control workers have left the job, either gone off long-term sick and eventually been forced to leave the job. Because they've just not been able to cope with what happened on that night. But of course, however bad it is for those firefighters and those control workers, it's only going to be so much worse for those bereaved family members and those victims of Grenfell Tower and the community as a whole, who are, as I say, 5 years on, we still do not have answers. There are still people living in buildings that are not fit for purpose, that are death traps. We still have politicians who are shifting the blame. I said this the other day on GB News, that we're 5 years on, and the only person who has lost their job over Grenfell Tower has been a firefighter, and that was Danny Cotton. And that's disgraceful, when it was not Danny Cotton who put that cladding on that building, yet it's the firefighters who, up until this point, have been the ones to shoulder the blame.
Well, Lucy, thank you so much for joining us to share your insights this morning. Lucy Mahmood, their barrister and former firefighter, to talk about the 5th anniversary of the Grenfell Tower fire. Now, since the beginning of the millennium, self-styled strongmen have risen to power around the world. That's according to Gideon Rachman, the author of The Age of the Strongman, How the Cult of the Leader Threatens Democracy Around the World. Well, we're delighted to say he joins us now to discuss his book. Gideon, thank you for joining us this morning. When and how and why did this new style of strongman leadership arrive?
Well, I think almost kind of too symbolically, it actually starts on the first day of the new century, which is when Vladimir Putin becomes president of Russia. That's his first full day in the office. And for a while, he's a kind of anomalous figure with his kind of personality cult, very macho style of leadership, contempt for other institutions other than his own ability to rule. But I think over the next 20 years, you then get a whole rush of them. You have Erdogan in Turkey, crucially Xi Jinping in China, who even gets his own thought written into the Chinese constitution. Erdogan, Putin, Xi all abolished term limits on their presidencies so they can rule for life. And then begin to see it entering the democratic world. I think Modi in India is a strongman ruler, and Donald Trump in the United States, very much so, is this kind of personality cult. I alone can do it, he says. He says that America is in a dreadful state and that he's the only guy who can turn it round. And after that, you get Bolsonaro in Brazil, Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia. So really, you know, most of the world's most populous countries, for a while at least, are run by strongman rulers.
Completely new phenomenon, because going back throughout history, we can see examples of sort of strongman leaders, can't we?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that there's a period, however, after maybe the fall of the Berlin Wall, when at least most of the big countries in the world, and that would include Russia, China, etc., they may not be democracies, but they don't have these kind of macho personality cult leaders. They tend to have more of a kind of collective leadership, and they tend to at least try to embrace independent institutions and so on. And I think that then changes really with the coming of Putin and then the bunch of Putin imitators who then come to power. And I think we're still very much in the age of the strongman, but it's possible that because Putin appears to have made such a terrible mistake with the invasion of Ukraine, that style of leadership so centered around a single individual and his judgment will go out of fashion again. And I certainly hope so.
Have you found that throughout kind of your research for this book that some of the sort of perceived stronger female leaders have felt they've had to kind of adopt that more masculine, macho style in order to get on?
Well, actually, you know, I would say probably there aren't that many female strongman leaders. And in fact, I think one of the characteristics of this phenomenon is it's a very male thing, and often it's a sort of backlash against feminism or against, you know, gay rights or whatever. I mean, Putin, for example, apparently said that he felt it was an insult that the Americans were sending women like Hillary Clinton and Condi Rice to negotiate with him, a deliberate insult. And, you know, he poses bare-chested and all of that, and makes a big thing about the decadence of the West, which he associates with gay rights, trans rights, etc. He says that shows that, you know, something's gone really badly wrong there. And, you know, similarly, Trump, you know, famously talks, you know, in very kind of obscene ways about his relationships with women. Berlusconi in Italy, these are very macho guys. Modi in India, actually, they make a big thing of the size of his chest. It's a very male style of leadership. And I think that's partly because it's kind of a cultural backlash. These are leaders who are what I call nostalgic nationalists. They tend to say, look, things were better in the past. We and the country can go back to make America great again, as Trump put it. You know, you go back to a previous era, which was much more socially conservative and more male-centered.
Mm. And you mentioned the kind of kickback to Putin's leadership style, clearly because of the situation in Ukraine. Do you think that the kind of era of the strongman leader is soon to come to an end?
Well, I think that would be premature. I think there's a chance, you know, because I think also that Xi in China is actually in trouble a bit because he's trying to extend his rule at the end of the year to essentially to rule for life, really. And unfortunately for him, the zero COVID policy in China has really gone quite badly wrong. They've had to lock down the whole of Shanghai, 25 million people for a couple of months. They're just trying to reopen, and now they've had another COVID outbreak. The economy is really suffering. And again, he really identified that policy with himself in the same way that Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine, was very closely identified with Putin. So I think strongmen can get discredited by making a big mistake. The difficulty is they're very hard to get rid of. You know, everybody's speculating, will somebody in the Russian leadership move against Putin? But it's not that easy. And similarly, in China, very hard to get rid of Xi Jinping. So I think they're having that style of leadership is being discredited, but you know, they're hard to get rid of. And even in democracies, I mean, you saw Donald Trump attempt to essentially dispute the election. Bolsonaro in Brazil, who might lose this November, has already started saying, oh, well, this election will be fraudulent if I lose. These are not people who give up power easily.
Mm. And how much of that is linked to pure ego?
A lot. I mean, I think that, you know, Trump is probably the clearest pure narcissist of these leaders. But I think that they are people who encourage a personality cult. So that in India, for example, you know, Modi, I mean, maybe it's partly just a political style adopted by his party, but if you get vaccinated in India, the vaccination certificate you're given has Modi's face on it. And Xi Jinping, they've, as I said, they've incorporated his thoughts, such as it is, into the Chinese constitution. So, yeah, it's all about the single individual. But I also think there's often an element of self-preservation, because if, like Putin, you've been in power for 20 years, you've probably done quite a few things, violence, corruption, etc., which would mean that if you step down, you're actually at risk. And so these leaders, because of the way that they rule, are very reluctant to give up power for a mixture, as you say, of ego reasons, but also just self-preservation. It's too dangerous to step down.
Well, Gideon, thank you for joining us this morning. Gideon Rachman there, author of The Age of the Strongman, How the Cult of the Leader Threatens Democracy Around the World. But that's it for the first hour of The Political Correction. Keep those views coming in. Email us on gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us @gbnews. See you soon.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV, on radio, on digital.
Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices.
With honest and civilised conversation.
We're not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
And the national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
Join us for Ministry of Offence, the comedy panel show that's just like the news, in that the left fights the right and it doesn't really seem to matter who wins. We cover the big stories. It was, in fact, a troop of baboons and not angry vegans.
I like that.
And the really important stories.
Fat naked cow gets stuck in swimming pool.
It's a headline in a lot of local newspapers. Yeah.
We're on the same team, Nick. Yeah, but I'm just helping you.
Join us for Ministry of Offence, Saturday nights, 8 o'clock on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Good morning. You're watching and listening to GB News, and coming up on The Political Correction, we'll discuss soaring petrol prices reaching £100 a tank and the impact this will have on people across the country. With this year marking 40 years since President Ronald Reagan addressed Parliament, how strong is the special relationship today? And 40 years on, we'll talk about the legacy of the Falklands War. That plus plenty more after the latest news with Tatiana.
Good morning. It's 1 minute past 11. I'm Tatiana Sanchez in the GB newsroom. Unions have hit out against a potential government plan to change the law allowing agency workers to cover for striking staff. Major travel chaos is expected later this month after workers voted overwhelmingly in favour of industrial action in a dispute over pay, jobs, pensions and conditions. Writing in The Sun on Sunday, the Transport Secretary Grant Shapps said they could also be banned from working overtime to make up for lost earnings during the strike. RMG General Secretary Mick Lynch told GB News the government shouldn't keep changing the law.
Well, it's illegal at the minute, isn't it? And Grant Shapps should defend the rule of law, but now he's threatening to change the law in order to break an industrial dispute. I don't think it'll have any particular effect. These regulations have been in place for a fairly long time. I think they were brought in by the Blair government, and they've been completely ineffective. People are using these in disputes already, which is against the law. So rather than saying that he's going to change the law every time he's at a disadvantage, what he should do is unshackle the companies and fund the railways correctly so that we can have a settlement to this dispute.
The government says legislation to scrap parts of the Northern Ireland Protocol will not break international law. Due to be introduced in Parliament tomorrow, the Northern Ireland Secretary Brandon Lewis says it will be both lawful and correct. But Sinn Féin's President Mary Lou McDonald has accused him of talking through his hat. Mr Lewis told GB News the Good Friday Agreement will be protected and respected.
Fundamentally, what is stopping the Northern Ireland Assembly and the Executive getting back up and running. And at the moment, the way the protocol is working, the way the EU want to see it implemented, is fundamentally undermining the Belfast Good Friday Agreement that has given us now 24 years of peace and growing prosperity in Northern Ireland. We've got to fix that. It's damaging for businesses and for people in Northern Ireland, and we've got to fix it. So we will be laying out tomorrow, as we said we would do, we're going to lay out some legislation tomorrow that will resolve those issues with the Northern Ireland Protocol in a way that protects and respects the Belfast Good Friday Agreement.
President Volodymyr Zelensky says Ukraine has recaptured villages and towns in the southeastern regions of Kherson and Zaporizhzhia. He also says fierce street fights are continuing in the eastern city of Severodonetsk. It's after he met with the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen to discuss Ukraine's request to join the EU. He says he's hopeful and described the meeting as very fruitful. Hundreds of people have been marching across US cities as part of an anti-gun violence protest. Teachers and students, among others, called on Congress to pass legislation aimed at curbing gun violence. Late last month, the gunman in Uvalde, Texas, killed 19 children and 2 teachers just days after another gunman killed 10 people in a Buffalo, New York grocery store. Well, President Joe Biden backed the protests.
Yes, keep marching. It's important. Look, this has to become an election issue. The way people listen, senators, congressmen, is when people say, this is going to affect my vote. Too many people are dying needlessly. And what's even being proposed in the House and Senate is marginal. I mean, it's important, but it's not all that needs to be done.
The Queen has become the world's second longest reigning modern monarch. The 96-year-old overtakes Thailand's king, who reigned for 70 years and 126 days. The longest reigning monarch is Louis XIV of France, with a 72-year reign and 110 days. This is GB News. We'll bring you more news as it happens. Now it's back to the political correction.
Good morning. You're watching and listening to GB News, and this is the political correction. We're here for the next hour to correct politics and put you, the people, back in charge. Coming up this hour, we'll discuss how soaring fuel costs hitting £100 a tank this week will affect people up and down the country in an already escalating cost of living crisis. And former Republican congressman and ally of Ronald Reagan talks to us about the special relationship between the UK and the United States. And as ever, if you want to get involved in the conversation and have your email read out on air, then email us on gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at gbnews. This is the political correction. Well, after a very fiery first hour, loads of you have been getting in touch to share your thoughts. Lots of you, particularly about the RMT rail strikes. Mick, I'm guessing not Mick Lynch here, but people like Kelvin and why people like me would leave the Conservative Party. I support workers' right to withdraw their Labour. Paul?
Yeah, same subject. Jeffrey says, as a person living in the north of England, nobody has ever asked me for my opinions, and I get fed up of people telling me what I'm thinking. If a rail worker on 45k cannot afford to feed or clothe their children, what are they spending their money on? There are many other groups of workers earning much less than this who are more deserving of a pay rise. But I think, in fairness, as Mick Lynch pointed out, this isn't a dispute just about train drivers. This is a dispute about all grades right across the railway system, many of whom don't earn anything like the amount that train drivers earn.
We've got James here who says, what an arrogant man Mr Lynch is. He will cause misery and suffering for people when he's paid a large amount to screw everyone else down. We're on a downward spiral to the 70s with unions, and if Labour got in, we would have chaos.
And on Boris Johnson, Sian says, I'm not keen on Boris, but I think he's a strong politician and would vote for him again. The pandemic was a new emergency scenario. Boris had to adapt daily, as did we all. No one could have done any better.
And a few more of you getting in contact there about Boris as well. Malcolm says, you asked how he thought about you supporting Boris. I'd say keep on supporting him, but pressure him at all times to return to more traditional Conservative policies, most specifically to drop his infernal net zero obsession.
And Paul says, Boris Johnson is a divisive figure and we know full well that he came with a reputation, but we voted for him because he was passionate about policy. Nobody else has the personality or statesmanship like he has. I'm not entirely sure about statesmanship. Be very careful what you wish for. The alternative is scary.
And then finally, one from Karen here who says, further to you raising the point about not voting for Boris this week, I respect your different point of view. I'm not sure I would have voted for him either. I listen to GB News a lot and I do not always agree with presenters or their panels, but I enjoy hearing other people's points of views. I often shout during discussions when I don't agree, but everyone has a right to express their point of view and everyone has a right to disagree. It's called free speech. And that is what we at GB News here are all about. So do keep your views coming in and we'll get some more read out later in the show. Now, the cost of living crisis has reached a new milestone this week as the average price of filling a car tops £100 for the first time, reaching an average of 182p for a litre of unleaded and 188p for diesel. Predictions say the situation is likely to become even worse, with the RAC and the AA urging action from the Chancellor to tackle the crisis. But the costs are already hitting hard-strapped families across the nation. At least 46% of the cost of fuel is taxation, made up of fuel duty and VAT. So could tax cuts be the solution to the escalating problem? Paul, the cost of fuel is just getting mad, isn't it?
It's absolutely crazy. I mean, I drove to South Wales yesterday and a tank of petrol for me, like many other people across the country, was about £105, I think it was, that I paid. And you know, for working people suffering other issues at the moment with the cost of living crisis, having to do that, particularly if people have got a job that involves them travelling around, you know, if they've got a works van or something for their job and they have to pay petrol, I mean, it is extremely, extremely difficult for people. So, yeah, I mean, I think there's certainly a case for a further cut to fuel duty, but equally, you know, we can't just apply sticking plasters here. I think we've got a long-term problem in terms of, you know, we need to do much better at securing our long-term supplies around oil and gas. You know, we need to talk about restarting the Cambo oil field project. I also think we need to have the debate about public transport and going back to what we were talking about, the railway system. The truth is that much public transport today, especially the trains, are dirty, they're unreliable, they're expensive. If you had a clean, reliable, cheap system, then arguably lots more people would be willing to travel by public transport. But the truth is, I think since privatisation, the whole quality of the railway system has declined. So people feel like they're forced into their cars, really. So it's extremely difficult for people at the moment. They're living with some real difficulties and pressure points in terms of the pressure on their finances. But we need to look long term, and actually we need to look at getting growth into the economy. We need to look at getting real wages rising, and there doesn't, to me, seem to be any serious plan around that. On
your point about infrastructure kind of investment and making it kind of leaner and greener and less reliant on oil, is that where I make a cheeky point and say if there were fewer demands for wage increases, there'd be more money to reinvest in the network? Is that where I take my opportunity? Cheeky points like that since time immemorial. I've been very well behaved this show, Paul.
Don't ask for a pay increase, because what we'll do, we'll invest in the service and then you'll be better off in the
Exactly
long run.
right.
I'm not falling for that, Davis.
Well, joining us now to discuss this further is policy analyst at the Taxpayers Alliance, Darwin Friend. Darwin, thank you for your time this morning. Let's talk about tax on fuel, because it is a big chunky percentage of the cost for consumers, isn't it?
It is, and firstly, thank you both for having me on the show this morning. When we think about fuel, we have to, of course, think about tax. And I mean, the 5p cut that the government took to fuel duty earlier this year was a welcome change, but it only brought fuel duty down to 52.95p per litre. And so the current average cost of petrol was 175p per litre. 47% of that is tax. And so if the government really wants to support people through the cost of living crisis with the increasing cost of fuel, then there's one easy way it could do that, and that's cut the amount of tax on fuel.
And obviously, on fuel, people are double taxed as well because fuel duty goes on first and then VAT goes on once the fuel duty's already been added.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so you pay VAT before the amount of fuel duty is on, and then you pay VAT on the fuel duty itself. So the government is essentially taxing a tax. And I think if this was the only way to ease the cost of living pressures, then the government could easily go for that. But I think there's also other options that the government could take as well to ease other pressures. I mean, one thing that we're calling for in particular is for the 1p cut in income tax to be brought forward and even better doubled, because as you were just talking about, that's one way to not only leave more money in people's pockets, but it's also going to boost economic growth and average earnings in the long term as well.
And in terms of other taxes, VAT is one that's often talked about, particularly with regards to fuel and home energy as well. Would you, be in favour of a VAT cut on fuel and on sort of electricity?
Well, I think with VAT, it's quite complicated because there are so many opt-outs and so many rules about it. And so I think what we have to be careful of is making it an even more complicated system than it already is. I mean, we want to have as simple a tax system as possible so that then that can boost economic growth. I think what the government could do in return is, I mentioned the income tax as a potential way to solve the crisis. You could cut fuel duty, revert the NI hike. There are plenty of options for the government to take, but I think potentially complicating the tax system further isn't the solution in this case.
And let's very quickly talk about Tax Freedom Day, which of course this year was on Wednesday, but is forecast to reach as far as, is it June the 28th by 2026 or something along those lines? I mean, at the TPA, that must appall you.
Yeah, it's frankly absurd that we're seeing taxes go up by so much. I mean, we've got the Tax Freedom Day being pushed back even further, seemingly year on year. We've got a 70-year high tax burden, and we found that the average household is going to be paying £1 million in tax over their lifetime. And so what the government now needs to do is start actually acting on tax, not only because it's going to leave more money in people's pockets and help them with the cost of living crisis, but it's the right thing to do because people themselves know what their personal priorities are and should be able to spend their money on what they think is best for them.
Well, I'd completely agree with you there, Darwin. Darwin Friend there joining us from the Taxpayers Alliance to talk about tax on fuel. Now, the UK government's plan to send asylum seekers to Rwanda has been given the go-ahead by the High Court after facing a legal challenge under emergency proceedings. Under the policy, some of those entering the UK illegally will be flown to Rwanda to apply for asylum there. And it's thought that about 31 people will be on the first flight next Tuesday. Questions are being asked by charities, including whether Rwanda is a safe third country and whether the policy breaches the European Convention on Human Rights. Now, Paul, this was quite a big ruling, wasn't it?
It was a big ruling, and the legal experts will obviously know whether it was right or wrong. I think there's a moral dimension to these things. I mean, it's perfectly possible to accept the legal ruling while not necessarily agreeing morally with what the government's doing. And I understand people's queasiness around it. I really do. I understand why people are uneasy about the idea that people can come here and then be relocated to Rwanda. But the truth is, Deanna, as I've said on this programme before, the current situation was simply unsustainable. We could not go on with a situation where hundreds of undocumented migrants were landing on our shores every month, and sometimes thousands over the course of a month. As much as anything, I think it undermines people's faith in the system. And I generally believe that people in this country are tolerant and they're open to the idea of immigration and they're open to the idea of taking refugees and even economic migrants, actually. They just want the system to be managed properly, and they want the numbers to be modest and manageable. And the key thing we have to do is to remove the incentive of people to make those hazardous trips in the first place, and we haven't done that. So I say I get into debates with a lot of my colleagues on the left over this. You have to come up with your own solutions. By all means, criticise the Rwanda policy, but what is your solution to stop those crossings being made, which are putting those lives at risk? What are your solutions to stopping undocumented people arriving here? And often people don't have any solutions. And I think that's in large part, because many of those people actually have an open borders philosophy. They really have no ideological problem with the kind of let them all come approach. However, often they're not quite honest enough to say that in a debate because they know it probably wouldn't be popular. So they find other kind of obscure, convoluted reasons to articulate their case. So, you know, attack it by all means, and people do, and the Archbishop of Canterbury has done it, and Prince Charles, so we understand now, has done it, and others have done it. But unless you come up with some solutions yourself, I think you're kind of undermining your own argument.
And how much of this, I know we were discussing this before the show, but how much of this do you think is because it is a country like Rwanda that's so kind of culturally different to our nation? If we were kind of offshoring to, I don't know, the Netherlands or to Australia, do you think there'd be a different reaction?
I think some of the protests would be more muted. I think that's probably true. I mean, in fact, I tweeted this yesterday. If they were being relocated to Ireland or Canada or somewhere like that, so you do have to kind of ask what is the motivation for people to get so angry that it's Rwanda, and actually some of those people are making accusations of racism at the Home Secretary and others who are pushing the policy. But probably kind of betraying a little bit of their own unconscious racism by saying how dare you send these people to this terrible place in Africa. So people probably need to examine their consciences on that a little bit, because I think there is a little bit of that in their minds.
And I think your point is exactly right in how do we firstly get a grip of this so that those coming here are documented, because there is a distinction, isn't there, between those who follow the kind of legal routes and enter the country legally as migrants, you know, fleeing persecution, whatever it might be, and then those who enter illegally. And that's what this policy is about, isn't it? It's about, you know, really figuring out that distinction, and it's only those entering illegally that will be kind of eligible for this relocation. And as we've discussed before, those who are genuinely fleeing persecution, we should, of course, offer kind of our services to and offer a safe home and a safe haven. But unfortunately, there are a lot of economic migrants who come across the channel and attempt to claim asylum when actually that's not the reason behind their crossing, isn't it?
And that distinction is a really important one, actually, because I think the British people get that distinction. And I think broadly, I think the British people say, look, we will accommodate refugees, people who are, I mean, look at the Ukraine, for example. You know, the millions of British people who have opened their arms to welcome Ukrainian refugees. That's something to be very proud of. But equally, I think people say, look, economic migrancy is a different thing.
Yeah.
That's people who are attempting to come to Britain, not because they are fleeing persecution or war, but they just want a better life for themselves. Now, that in itself is not an ignoble ambition.
Absolutely
not.
not.
If you want to go to a better country to earn more money or to improve your standards of living for yourself and your family, it doesn't make you a bad person.
But there has to be honesty about it, doesn't there?
You have to be honest about it, and you have to understand that the receiving country is entitled to apply some robust procedures around that. And to say, look, we're not in a position to take everybody, and if you can't come legally as an economic migrant, then it doesn't do just to say, well, I'm going to come anyway, I'm going to get in a boat and come anyway. And I think we need to be clear about that distinction, because the British public are clear about it, but I think some political activists almost try to cloud it for their own ends.
Yeah, I think that's right. Well, let us know your views. Do you think the government is right to carry forward this policy on Rwanda? Email us on gbviews@gbnews.uk. And coming up on The Political Correction, we're talking about the so-called special relationship between the UK and the USA. So don't go anywhere.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV, on radio, on digital.
Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices.
With honest and civilised conversation.
We're not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
The national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
Join us for Ministry of Offence, the comedy panel show that's just like the news, in that the left fights the right and it doesn't really seem to matter who wins. We cover the big stories. It was in fact a troop of baboons and not angry vegans.
I like that.
And the really important stories.
Fat naked cow gets stuck in swimming pool.
It's a headline in a lot of local newspapers. Yeah.
We're on the same team, Nick. Yeah, but I'm just helping you.
Join us for Ministry of Offence, Saturday nights, 8 o'clock on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christys.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday for To The Point on GB News.
Well, welcome back to The Political Correction, and loads of you getting in touch, as always. Richard here says on Boris Johnson, only the constituents of Uxbridge and South Ruislip voted for Boris, not the rest of us. Thankfully, we do not, as yet, have a presidential system in our country. Political parties choose their leaders, not the voters. We vote to elect our MPs.
We've got Elaine singing your praises here, Deanna. Well done, lovely lady, for being so honest in revealing how you voted in the confidence vote. Many could really learn from you. GB News is all about that freedom of speech that other stations disallow. Keep going, love the show. RMT chap rather rude and scrappy. You didn't interrupt his long monologue, and yet he cut you off mid-question.
And then we've got Alan, who says on cost of living, VAT should be abolished altogether as it was invented by the EU, which we're no longer a member. It should be replaced by the old purchase tax.
And same subject, Maureen, listening to you this morning, do not forget there are many low-paid people, pensioners and the like, who live in the countryside where there is a lack of public transport, doctors, dentists, banks, post office and shops, and the cost of fuel is often higher.
And then we've got Fred again on VAT. VAT is a vicious tax, and because it's worked out as a percentage, every time there's a wholesale increase in the prices of any commodity, it brings a windfall for the government. This windfall should be used to make the commodities more affordable to the population.
And on Rwanda, Paul says, is there a hint of white supremacy among the challengers to this policy? Only white folk can give economic migrants a new start, ? Britain is giving billions to a poor developing nation and people to help build it.
Yeah, so loads of your views. Thank you for sending them in, and do keep them coming because we really want to hear from you. So this week marked 40 years since President Ronald Reagan addressed Parliament, becoming the first US president to do so. President Reagan focused on the shared values between our two nations and spoke about our long-standing and precious political bond, famously dubbed the special relationship. The UK and the United States are regarded as each other's closest ally on the world stage, but with the current global political climate and the rising prominence of issues such as the Northern Ireland Protocol, how strong is the so-called special relationship today, and will it stand the test of time? Paul, 40 years since Reagan was in Parliament. That was quite a pivotal moment, wasn't it?
It was quite a pivotal moment. I mean, I have to say I've always kind of felt the special relationship has been a little bit one way. I think we probably, and successive British governments, have probably invested quite a lot more in it than US governments have, actually. And I think if you look at our joint history, the US and Britain, There have been times, really, when America, I think, has been found a little bit wanting in that relationship. I mean, I know, people recognise the fact that America joined us in the Second World War and obviously made a difference in that. But they weren't involved for the first 2 years, let's not forget. And when we were really under the cosh, by the way, we had the Blitz going on and what have you. Didn't really support us over Suez. I mean, the actions of the British government were quite appalling, but didn't really support us in any way over that. The Falklands War, I know the kind of narrative now is that they were there for us. Actually, if you look at the beginning and some of the negotiations that were taking place, and America seeking to kind of cut a deal which would have given some kind of sovereignty, some sort of guarantee to the Argentinians, was not, let's say, was not a full-throated ally of Britain, certainly in the early stages of that conflict. And of course, America is a far, far bigger country than we are, so they probably don't have to care as much about us than we do about them. I mean, look, we do share a lot of, obviously, we've got a joint history, we've got a joint language, a joint culture to a certain degree. But I think we need to open our eyes and understand that they probably don't care about it quite as much as we do.
I think one example in very recent history was obviously Biden's decision to withdraw troops from Afghanistan, which was done completely unilaterally, despite the fact that, we entered into that kind of conflict with the Americans very much as a team. And I don't know, I think for me, under Biden, that struck me because it felt like the first indication that actually the special relationship, certainly from his side, perhaps wasn't as central to his thinking.
I mean, that was indefensible. I mean, it's a good example. It was indefensible, I think, what he did in terms of how we'd been so together in Afghanistan since 2001, whatever people's views on the conflict. I mean, clearly the US and the UK were in it together. And to have kind of left us in the lurch, and obviously once the Americans went, there was no question that we wouldn't have to go as well. Of course, we had to. I just wonder sometimes with Biden, I sense that Biden is always, as we know, very keen to emphasise his Irishness. And I just wonder sometimes whether with some people that kind of Irishness, that emphasising their Irishness, can sometimes slip into a bit of anti-Britishness. I'm certainly not suggesting that's the case with the majority of people with Irish ancestry, but I think for some people it can. And I just wonder sometimes if that is the type of thing that colours Biden's thinking around some of these issues. I don't think he sees himself particularly as being a strong ally of Britain. I think he probably values the relationship, like all presidents do. I don't think he particularly sees us as a strong ally. I don't think Obama did particularly, but I don't think, frankly, many presidents have done. They will say the right things, and they will always, when they're given a joint press conference with the Prime Minister, talk about the importance of the special relationship. I'm not convinced they always mean it.
And let's just quickly talk about, again, the sort of Biden-Irishness issue, because, of course, one of the big issues that's playing out at the moment in UK politics is around the Northern Ireland Protocol and negotiations with the EU on this. And yet Biden, but in particular Nancy Pelosi, seem to be very much, against what the UK is trying to achieve here, claiming that it's going to sort of protect the peace process, but actually maybe perhaps failing to recognise some of the intricacies of it.
And I just think it's completely presumptuous, actually, for a foreign country to interfere so overtly and explicitly in the internal because they are internal dealings of another country. Now, the reality is, whatever the complexities of Northern Ireland and whatever people's views, whether they lean towards nationalism or unionism or whatever, as things stand, politically and legally, Northern Ireland is an integral part. It's an integral part of the United Kingdom. And that means that when it comes to internal issues around the protocol, around a hard border and all the rest of it, that's for us to deal with. I don't believe it's for America, even Americans with Irish ancestry, because they're American politicians or whatever, to poke their noses in. I don't think our prime ministers and senior politicians would dream of doing it over an internal American issue.
Absolutely not.
And I don't think really it's got anything to do with them. And I was quite disturbed, actually, and I tweeted about it, to see Keir Starmer and the Shadow Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, effectively prostrating themselves yesterday, I think it was, before a US official. I think the Belfast consul, as he's termed by the White House. And they were saying in a tweet that, you know, we're here to meet with this American official and to allay his concerns effectively. I don't think it's a job of British politicians to go to American politicians and allay concerns over an issue that is entirely within the jurisdiction and the territorial domain of the UK. I was quite disturbed to see it.
Well, we're agreeing on a lot today, Paul, because I too was very disturbed on that point. I don't know, we'll get back to unions and then we'll be at each other again, never mind. Well, coming up next, broadcasting legend Alistair Stewart tells us what's coming up on his show, and memories of the Falklands. Our Home and Security editor Mark White brings us a special report to mark 40 years since the end of the Falklands War. All this and more coming up after the latest news with Tatiana.
It's 11:32. I'm Tatiana Sanchez in the GB newsroom. Unions have hit out against a potential government plan to change the law allowing agency workers to cover for striking staff. Major travel chaos is expected later this month after workers voted overwhelmingly in favour of industrial action in a dispute over pay, pensions and conditions. Writing in The Sun on Sunday, the Transport Secretary Grant Shapps said they could also be banned from working overtime to make up for lost earnings during the strike. RMT General Secretary Mick Lynch told GB News the government shouldn't keep changing the law.
Well, it's illegal at the minute, isn't it? And Grant Shapps should defend the rule of law, but now he's threatening to change the law in order to break an industrial dispute. I don't think it'll have any particular effect. These regulations have been in place for a fairly long time. I think they were brought in by the Blair government, and they've been completely ineffective. People are using these in disputes already, which is against the law. So rather than saying that he's going to change the law every time he's at a disadvantage, what he should do is unshackle the companies and fund the railways correctly so that we can have a settlement to this dispute.
The government says legislation to scrap parts of the Northern Ireland Protocol will not break international law. Due to be introduced in Parliament tomorrow, the Northern Ireland Secretary Brandon Lewis says it will protect and respect the Good Friday Agreement. The EU has already said changing the post-Brexit trade agreement would be a breach and there could be retaliatory action. The Queen has become the world's second longest reigning modern monarch. The 96-year-old overtakes Thailand's king, who reigned for 70 years and 126 days. The longest reigning monarch is Louis XIV of France, with a 72-year and 110-day reign. TV, online and DB Plus Radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to the political correction.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV, on radio, on digital.
Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices.
With honest and civilised conversation.
We're not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
The national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
Join us for Ministry of Offence, the comedy panel show that's just like the news, in that the left fights the right and it doesn't really seem to matter who wins. We cover the big stories. It was in fact a troop of baboons and not angry vegans.
I like that.
And the really important stories.
Fat naked cow gets stuck in swimming pool.
It's a headline in a lot of local newspapers. Yeah.
We're on the same team, Nick. Yeah, but I'm just helping you.
Join us for Ministry of Offence, Saturday nights, 8 o'clock on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back to The Political Correction. And as you know, coming up at midday on GB News is Alastair Stewart and Friends. And I'm delighted to say that our very own broadcasting legend, Alastair Stewart, joins us in the studio now. What's coming up today, Alastair?
I think we need to talk about childcare. And before everybody goes, oh, God, childcare, just banging on about it, what have you. Last month, there was a brilliant report, the McAllister report, that said this is a sector that's got real problems. There are kids who are in care who are being abused. There are kids who are not getting decent education who then turn in to adolescent criminals and then adult criminals, all sorts of stuff like that. And it was in need of urgent reform. Then the BBC did a brilliant report on one particular group of care homes and real difficulties that were there. And then the FT on top of that did a bit about how they're so profitable, some of these places, not all of them, but some of them, that overseas investors, not least in the Middle East, are pouring an awful lot of money into it.
Wow.
Now, my punchline, as I say, before people go, oh, God, it's just them banging on about that again, is that the McAllister report says unless it's a sector that's reformed, within 10 years it will cost you, me and you, every taxpayer in this country, £15 billion, and there could be as many as 100,000 young folk in care.
Goodness.
Therefore, it matters because they're innocents, and it matters because it's our taxpayer money. So that's one of the things. And our lovely friend, our mutual friend, Robert Halfon, the chair of the Education Select Committee, is coming on, and he's embraced it, as has Nadeem Zahawi, to be fair, but we want to see what they're going to do about it. And the other thing is Ukraine. Look at the front pages. Tories at war, Charles at war, and what have you. Ukraine is slipping back and back and back in the newspapers, and yet Zelensky says we need more weapons, we need more ammunition, or we are facing real trouble. So Helen Celeste, who's a real expert in Odessa, is joining us live to chat about it. And finally, just ahead of the Falklands anniversary, amazing interview with the Falklands widow. She lost her Lance Corporal childhood sweetheart, and she grieved. She suffered post-traumatic stress disorder, but now, to her eternal credit, she helps other widows and mums and dads get over it 40 years on. Amazing.
Alistair, the Falklands, it's 40 years. It's a fairly big anniversary, but there seems to have been, on an official level at least, there seems to have been nothing. There's no memorial service official has been held. I don't see the government actually intervening in any way.
I thought that the other day because I went to a Royal British Legion event, and Admiral Lord West was the main speaker, and he was a ship's commander. He lost his ship in the Falklands, and he made precisely that point. And there isn't an answer to it. I mean, 40 years... The Legion and the government, to its great credit, does D-Day in a big way, and it does November in a big way. But somehow or another, the Falklands hasn't yet gained that place. But, you know, hundreds of British soldiers were killed there. It was a huge political event. Maybe it's coloured because of the Thatcher involvement.
Well, I was just about to say...
Well, I don't want to talk about that because it helped Thatcher get back in '83. Yeah. I genuinely don't know, but I know the Legion cares about it, and we've produced some brilliant 40 years on. We will remember them as well.
Because there was certainly nothing like the controversy around the Falklands as there was, for example, with the Iraq War under Tony Blair. I mean, the Falklands had broad support in this country. People thought, well, British sovereign territory has been invaded. We've got to go and get it back. So I just wonder if that Thatcher element, I mean, she's obviously...
It is possible.
Her statue is being daubed with paint every day.
I got so cross about that.
That could be the cause of it, maybe.
Utterly... I mean, you can have a decent debate about what happened to the United Kingdom economically and politically throughout the 80s, but to chuck eggs at someone who... got elected 3 times in a row seemed to me to be a bit vacuous.
It's the sort of thing a kid would do, and yet this is well-educated, kind of established people who are committing these ridiculous acts.
Do you think
on a
they were
statue.
well-educated?
Well, officially, according to the letters after their names...
With a chip on their shoulders.
Probably, well, one of them did have a number of letters after his name. Yeah. Very well-educated in terms of degrees. But...
I didn't spot that.
I'm a kind of opponent of pretty much everything that Thatcher did, but if you're going to have...
Were you?
Well, I was still quite young at the time, but I would have been if I was a political activist at the time.
When people say that, and we're very good friends, and I respect that. In fact, during the break, we were talking about other much more left-wing friends that we have in common, which is always good. But the thing I always say to folk who bemoan it is, if you want to knock Thatcher, then reread the history of the winter of discontent, the late 1970s, the way the unions in those days had the Labour Party literally like that, and the country was heading in one direction. She put forward a stark right-wing monetarist manifesto, was elected and re-elected and re-elected.
I think we're going to have to get you back on, Alistair, to have a proper debate about the merits of Thatcherism. Exactly, but before then, in just 20 minutes' time, you can tune in to Alistair and Friends and hear about some of the really interesting things he's going to be discussing. And it looks like we've nicked one of them, because now we're going to talk about the Falklands ourselves, because, as Alistair said, next week marks 40 years since the end of the Falklands War. A new photography exhibition by a young Falklander has gone on display at a special exhibition in the Chatham Dockyard. GB News Home and Security Editor Mark White brings this report from when he was given a one-on-one tour of the spectacular exhibition. Let's take a look.
I was taking shelter in the little hotel, the Upland Goose, just a few yards behind this point here. And I realised that they were advancing up the road, and I thought it worth popping out and trying to get a few snaps. And
you were obviously very close.
Yes, I was. And it was a wide-angle lens as well, so I was actually very close. Some of the troops were suspicious, and some of them were reasonably optimistic and gung-ho. So I wasn't quite sure what to make of it, but I thought it was worth it.
You took a risk, though, because you just never know. Young conscripts, armed, moving into the town, you never know how they're going to react.
Well, it's true, but I had a very strong sense that we were seeing history unfold, and it's not very often that you get a chance to do anything to record that. So I was very young, I was only 24, and yeah, I just saw it as an opportunity, so I really wanted to go for it. And that was the beginning of recording something that went on for 10 weeks or so.
Clearly, after the soldiers on foot, the heavy armour.
This was the kind of kit that really alarmed us, because it was very heavy armour. And you can see that there's a turret there with at least a .5-inch machine gun, if not a cannon. These were grinding through our streets. And I remember thinking at the time, it was a bit like the War of the Worlds, when these monstrous machines suddenly appear. And the day before that, we were used to Morris Minors and Land Rovers trundling down the road, and all of a sudden they were being ground to bits by these huge American-built amphibious personnel carriers, and they were scary. These were Pucará aircraft. They were designed and built in Argentina, and they were a very real concern because their ground attack capability was quite serious. You can see the drums on the wings that would have contained rockets, and they were fitted with machine guns as well. And in this occasion, that aircraft is circling low, very low over Stanley, and it went on for about half an hour because we could see there were a couple of Harriers at altitude just waiting for the chance to pounce on them. They could not compete with a Harrier, but on their own, against ground troops, they were very effective. I framed this out of my bedroom window, in fact, and I like the sort of domesticity. You've got the kitchen chimney there with the Argentine flag in the background, and the Argentine flag is actually flying from our Defence Force HQ mast, so there was something particularly symbolic about that. They'd taken over the Defence Force headquarters.
Graham, tell us about this shot.
Well, the Argentines were very poorly equipped with vehicles, so they took any civilian vehicle that took their fancy. And you can see that, the demand far exceeded supply. I did count how many Argentines were in this short wheelbase Land Rover, but
quite a few.
Certainly wasn't designed for that. But we all lost our vehicles, including mine and my father's. They would turn up with a piece of paper and the number of your vehicle written on it and a couple of rubber stamps, and said, "We're having it." And the usual story was, we're going to use it as an ambulance, but then they weren't. You'd see them the next day, full of troops.
Clearly, this one very starkly illustrates the human cost of this conflict. We know hundreds on both sides died, but he's lying right in the street of your hometown.
Yeah, there were a couple of bodies lying there, and fortunately for me, they had been covered up very roughly. But on the morning of the surrender, a friend and I decided that we would walk up towards where we knew the British lines were. And we first of all encountered these unfortunate Argentine soldiers who'd clearly been killed by artillery because the fence behind was riddled with shrapnel, and it was pretty clear that the same thing had happened to them. So at the time, I remember, actually my mind goes back to these photographs very, very often. At the time, I wasn't sure whether I should photograph it or not. And when it came to mounting this exhibition, I wasn't really sure whether I should use it or not. But you know, that is the reality.
It's war.
That's the truly horrible reality. I mean, I don't know, he was a young man and, you know, he didn't go home.
The surrender in full swing here. I mean, you can see all the detritus around the streets as well.
These Argentines are being rounded up by British troops. You can see, I think, Paras or Marines doing their best to round them up and at the same time getting these men to clear up a little bit. But the mess was unspeakable. This was one of our general stores here, which had been torched and was gone, but the smoke was still lingering. And when I look at these, I can almost still smell them. It was just a complete scene out of hell, frankly. We sort of segue into colour here because very shortly after the surrender, I laid my hands on some slide film. And yeah, it strikes me still that the short period of transition between total chaos and the death and destruction to everything being organised in a much more ceremonial and civilised way.
For these people, it was their home, and they were, you know, very badly affected by what happened. Tell us about these pictures.
People's homes were destroyed. The population of Stanley went from about 1,400 people down to 500 people, and many of them thought they would be safer out on the farms. And many of them went to Goose Green, for example, or to Pebble Island. And, you know, the words frying pan and fire come to mind, you know, because if they went to Goose Green, they were there locked up and had to endure the Battle of Goose Green. And this gentleman, Griff, who is a shepherd, he was actually the farm manager on Pebble Island, had been locked up with all the other people on the farm in one house for a period of about a month, having a pretty tough time. And he's now very definitely happy to be out with his sheep again. Joe, repairing his fence, which had just been run down by a military truck. And I kind of feel that the whole Falklands War, yes, it was about the Falkland Islanders, but it became far bigger than them, so much more than about the Falkland Islanders. And it's remained that way to a great extent. And everybody at the end of it just had to pick themselves up and get on with their lives. And I look at these guys, both of whom are now gone, and I'm quite proud of them, and I think they did a really good job. I wish they weren't perhaps a little bit forgotten.
Well, a great package there from our Home and Security editor, Mark White. But now let's have a look at some more of your views. Thank you for sending them in. I'm going to do a bit of a love-in for Paul. So he read out a nice one about me. I'm going to reciprocate. Ian here says, "Stop it, Paul. You'll get me voting Labour." Well, maybe not, but well said. And Don says, "If more Labour politicians spoke as honestly as Paul, maybe I would vote Labour again."
Bless you guys, the check's in the post. On Rwanda, Andy says, "If you were genuinely fleeing your country due to real issues, then Rwanda is a better option than your host country. If you are fleeing for non-genuine reasons, then you would not be happy with Rwanda."
And a lot of you getting in touch about Rwanda. Rick says the UK government's Rwanda policy is the right way to deal with economic migrants. And if the deportations go ahead, it will be a powerful deterrent to those wanting to use the illegal Channel crossings route.
And on the US special relationship, Barry says, "For me, I've never actually heard what the term special relationship actually means, as it does appear a tad one-sided. Maybe it's about time it was clearly defined."
And on the same story, George says, "My politics are generally a bit to the right of Attila the Hun, so I don't always agree with Paul. However, he's absolutely spot on this morning in his views on America. I've long felt that the special relationship only exists when it suits America." Well, thank you for sending your views in. We love to hear from you, and that is what this show is all about. Now it's time for an update on the week's biggest stories from the world of sport with our very own sports commentator and broadcaster, Aidan McGee. Aidan, I'm going to say something I never expected to say in my whole life. Let's talk about golf.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a huge golf fan myself, but this story actually has me gripped a little bit, actually. I've not said that about golf in many a long year, I must say. But, yeah, look, there's a breakaway tour which is Saudi-backed, OK? It's the Saudi Public Investment Fund. Your friends and mine, they bought Newcastle United in November amid huge controversy. They're now trying their hand in golf. This is sport washing under any other name. In fact, you don't even have to say that. I don't think... I mean, the head of the tour said he'd never heard of that word. He's going to have to look it up. But I think we all know what it means, don't we? Right. Now, the issue is Phil Mickelson was the face of it in terms of from the playing sense. The former world #1 Greg Norman was the administrative face of it. You know, he's in his 60s now, touching 70s, but he's the kind of overarching figure that's drawn the players in. Phil Mickelson was the person who, he's recently won a major, and so although he's a bit older than average, it's still seen as though most of the players have gone so far, or the ones that are slightly over the hill in terms of their career achievements. Ian Poulter, very solid, legendary Ryder Cup player. Lee Westwood as well, still not won a major, but still very competent in the Ryder Cup. So they've moved over. Now, so when you compare this Live Series, which is 14 events to run parallel with the PGA and the European Tour and a few others, they're the traditional competitions that the players compete in. You look at it and you think, well, the ones that have gone so far have been guys that are probably over the hill. Now, I felt there was a change on Thursday when Bryson DeChambeau defected. He's 28 years old. He's the 2020 US Open champion. He is in the prime of his career.
That's a big gamble, isn't it?
It is, but the money pool is just, I mean, you know, sooner or later it will have to stack up for all these players to leave, because to put it in some kind of context, I was looking at the prize money. Now, you get £4 million for winning a low-ranking tournament in this new Live Series. There's 14 events over the course of the year. If you win a major, which is the epitome, the nadir of the golfing, it's equivalent to winning Wimbledon in tennis, or the US or the Australian or whatever, you're talking $2.7 million. So the huge money is going to be in the Live Series, and eventually it talks. The problem they have at the moment is that while it's not commercially important for it to be a success, it does still have to have a TV deal. There was a report by Matt Hughes in the Daily Mail on Thursday saying they're struggling to get a TV deal at the moment because the TV companies like Sky, etc., and DAZN, they've all been offered this series, but they're hedging their bets and staying with the European Tour and with the PGA at the moment, because that's where the players are. Yeah. But you need a TV deal for sport washing to work, because if no one sees it, how can you cleanse your reputation? So it's a fascinating story. If we're looking at the kind of fodder that GB News takes part in terms of sport with a little bit of politics, it's got everything we need there. And it's been a seismic week, because the PGA decided on Thursday that if you went to the Live Series, you would not be allowed to go back into the PGA. But I don't see it make a huge amount of difference, because you can still play in the majors. They haven't precluded you from doing that. So there'll be no problem competing in the Live Series for 14 events of the year, picking, choosing, maybe doing 10 of them, but still taking part in the Masters and the Open, etc.
I mean, it seems to me the similarities really going back when
Premier League.
Well, I was going to say actually apartheid South Africa and the cricket tours, where people kind of and they did it for money. So you had the likes of Boycott and Graham Gooch went out there and others and earned a fortune through doing it, but actually, you know, undermined their own reputation, and they were banned from playing for England when they come back. So it seems to be that actually there's, you know, it's about money. It's
completely driven about money. But those were, when we look at the Premier League in football in the early 90s, that was media driven. Sky were heavily involved in that. It was all predicated on TV rights. 30 years later, it still underpins their network. So it's a little bit it's different this time, because the media's not quite as important in terms of where it's been led from, but they still need the coverage to make it work.
Well, that is all we've got time for today. Thank you for joining us this morning. You've been watching and listening to The Political Correction. As ever, we will be here next Sunday at 10 a.m. for 2 hours of discussion, debate and analysis of the week's biggest political stories. And up next, we've been chatting to him to get a sneak preview of what's on his show. It looks like a belter. It's Alastair Stewart and friends, so don't go anywhere.
Looking at the weather then, the UK is generally fine. Some scattered showers, though a dry day for many. Here are the details.
A chance of the odd shower for northern coasts during this morning across southwest England, though it will be mainly dry for much of the region with sunny spells.
Across southeast England, a fine morning with sunny spells, a low risk of seeing an isolated shower for a time.
And a calmer day across Wales than yesterday, though it will still be breezy in the north of the country. Generally fine with just the odd shower this morning.
Now, across to the Midlands, it's going to be a fine start to the day. The odd isolated shower at first, so there will be sunny spells as well. Feeling quite pleasant in the sunshine.
And there will be light